Hello and welcome to another special, almost lockdown episode of Material Matters with me, Grant Gibson. As regular listeners will know, the idea behind the show is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Now, usually we do this by visiting the guest workshop or studio, but for the time being, we're making do by recording over the internet instead. And today it gives me huge pleasure to be chewing the fat with Fernando Laposse. Although born in Paris, the up-and-coming designer spent his formative years in Mexico City. Subsequently, he returned to France before studying product design at Central St. Martin's in London, graduating in 2012 with a range of pieces made from blown sugar. Since then, he has created products from the loofah fruit and sisal. However, he's probably best known for Totomoxtle, a colourful and extremely beautiful veneer made from the husks of Mexican corn. The product was included in last year's Food Bigger Than the Plate at the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as being shortlisted for the London Design Museum's Beazley Designs for the Year in 2018. Laposse says his work is preoccupied with sustainability, the loss of biodiversity, community disenfranchisement, and the politics of food. Fernando, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me, Gwen.
No, it's my pleasure. So look, usually, as I said in the intro, we do these interviews in our guest studios or workshops. I know you have a place in East London, but you're not there at the moment. So where precisely are you?
So right now I'm in Mexico City, but I've been mainly working in the village where I developed Totomoxtle, which is in the mountains in the south of Mexico. So I'm sort of between Mexico City and this little village. I've just been sort of self-quarantining in both places and trying to work as best as I can.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, this podcast is emphatically not about the virus, but we can't really avoid it. What is it like in Mexico? How is it affecting day-to-day life?
So right now we're actually arriving to the sort of peak moment of the epidemic here. And although, there's strict rules regarding public places and things like that, we don't have an official lockdown and we seem to be coping all right. Although, it's hard to tell here because a lot of people can't really self-isolate. So, especially poorer people, they have to go out and work. And it's hard to really quantify how badly it is affecting people here. But I don't know. It's, I'm trying to do my best to be as responsible as I can while still working with the farmers that I usually work with.
Yeah, pre-virus, what was your routine? How would you split your time between the studio in London and Mexico?
I sort of have this thing that I do where I come to Mexico and I sort of focus a lot on sourcing the materials, talking to the people, establishing the connections that need to be established with everyone that I work with here. And then I take all of these materials back to London. And I suppose that's where, I spend more time to really kind of focus more on the material, start to develop new techniques to transform it. And that's where most of the design work happens. That's also where, it is in England where I think mostly about production, about how to then bring all of that development back to Mexico and then teach it to people that produce it here. So that's usually how I split my time. I come to Mexico about 3 or 4 times a year, for periods of up to a month at a time. And then the rest of the year I'm in London, just sort of developing everything.
I mean, obviously materials are essential to your practice. And as I alluded to in the intro, you've worked with sisal and the loofah fruit. But the one I'm keen to concentrate on today is this extraordinarily beautiful and colourful veneer made from corn husks called Totomoxtle, which, as you said, is made in the village of Tonahuixtla in the southwest of the country. Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the background to the material? Because it seems to me to be a story that involves macroeconomics, heritage, food culture, and design. There's a very personal narrative in there as well. Perhaps in the first place, we could maybe set the scene by explaining exactly how important corn is to Mexico.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I mean, as you say, corn is sort of extremely important in Mexico. It's the main grain here. It's the equivalent to our bread, basically, to our wheat. And you could say that without corn, you wouldn't have had sort of the big civilizations of Mexico. So culturally, it's very important because the discovery of corn allowed for the settlement of cultures like the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, etc. And it's something that has carried on until today. When I say the discovery of corn, that's also an important thing to mention because corn is sort of considered the first man-made plant in the sense that corn doesn't grow naturally in the wild the way we know it. I mean, obviously man has refined most of the grains and vegetables that we have nowadays, but corn is completely different to its closest wild relative. So what we know as corn today is the result of a mutation from a wild plant called teosinte, which was then selectively bred for close to 9,000 years to produce this huge diversity of the corn that we have nowadays. So even though in most of the world, we just know corn as the yellow sweet corn, there's hundreds of varieties and thousands of sub-varieties. And it is the most adaptable grain in the world. It can grow virtually anywhere from, the north of Canada in places where it's, frozen half of the year to deserts in the Sahara. It's a very, very versatile plant. And that is testament to, this ingenuity of agriculture, which allow for these big civilizations in Mexico to flourish. So, yeah, corn is, the most important sort of grain in our diet. So it's extremely important for gastronomical purposes, but also for biodiversity and for the livelihood of many, many people in Mexico.
It seems to me that the story here is really entwined with your own background, because you grew up in Mexico City, although, as we said, you were born in Paris. Your father was a baker and your mother an artist. In fact, you come from a long line of bakers. Your great-grandfather emigrated from the French-Italian Alps to set up a baking business. Were you not encouraged into the family firm, Fernando?
Yeah, I guess I was. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, we used to go to this was quite a large bakery, right? So it was almost like a small factory. So we used to go to the bakery to help my dad, especially after Christmas, which is the busiest time. And he would have us crack, 5,000 eggs in a day or something like that. So yeah, I think my dad was sort of grooming us to eventually, maybe take over or to be interested in it. But it just didn't work out that way. And I don't know, I think, funnily enough, I'm really into cooking. I'm really, really into cooking. But I don't go anywhere near an oven for baking. I'm really bad at making bread. And maybe, I don't know, I think I didn't want to deal with the pressure of being, the fifth generation of bakers. So I think I was trying to concentrate more on maybe my mother's side of the influence, which was more on the arts. But yeah, there's always been this sort of preoccupation with the sensitivity of food, the sensitivity of the arts combined. So maybe that's, I think for both things, you need a huge amount of observation capabilities, to be able to tell something right or why something works or doesn't, and to be very observant. And so yeah, I think I got those two things from my parents, the sort of food, preoccupation with food and quality of ingredients from my dad's side, and then the artistic side from my mom.
And was there a point in your childhood where you decided I wanted to become a designer?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I didn't know that, the profession of designer really existed. But I wanted to be an inventor. At some point, I wanted to be a biologist. And actually, I mean, I sort of started to become a maker from a very young age because for some reason it was very encouraged in my house to, if I wanted a toy or something, I had to make a toy. So, we were back then we had a period where we weren't living in Mexico City. We were living more in the countryside. So we had a lot of access to, things like wood and things like that. And, my parents have always been a little bit, free and almost irresponsible with some things because, for example, they allowed me to have a little machete when I was like 7, 8 years old, So I would, hack away at a piece of wood and make like spinning tops or slingshots or things like that. So, even though I wasn't aware of the profession of designer, I was always encouraged from a young age to, if I wanted something, I should make it and therefore design it.
And when did you first visit Tonahuixtla? It was a place you obviously immediately took some kind of liking to, and I'm wondering why.
Yeah, so we went to Tonahuixtla because there was a couple that were working for my parents, Delfino and Maria. And Delfino was sort of like my dad's right-hand man, He would run all sorts of errands for him, organize deliveries. He would drive us around sometimes. And Maria was in the house, mainly helping my mom with her classes, preparing food, etc. So they became really, really close to us. And well, actually, I just recently found out why we went to Tonahuixtla the first time because I had a completely different idea of why this happened. But I was just talking to them last week, and they told me the story. Basically, what happened? It's a little bit intense, but Mexico City in the 90s was a fairly dangerous place to be in. It was one of the most dangerous cities in the world, and Delfino was driving my dad's car, and I don't know, there was an attempt for hijacking the car, and he decided it would be a good idea to fight the hijackers off, and he managed to do that. I don't know how. But in the process, he got hit, and he had to have surgery afterwards. He was a bit hurt, and so he had to have like a couple months off, obviously from work. And my dad asked him, where do you want to spend that time? And he asked my dad if he could go back to his village and just rest up there. So my dad drove him to Tonahuixtla. So it was actually my dad that went there the first time, and he was quite impressed with the village, because it's just in such a remote area, and it's so peaceful that, I don't know, my dad just really was quite impressed with it. And Delfino was like, well, if you ever want to come and bring the kids, welcome to come over. So we actually went and visited Delfino towards the end of his, how do you call that, convalescence.
Right.
And yeah, we that's why we came to Tonahuixtla. So, this all happened because of a kick to the groin. So, we were just kind of laughing about it. If Delfino hadn't had been kicked in the groin, maybe we would have never found Tonahuixtla.
This never would have happened, this whole project. You were 6 when you first went, apparently.
Yeah, I was 6 years old. And like I said, Mexico City was super dangerous. So, playing out in the street was out of the question, and everything had to be sort of planned and organized and in advance, and you would have to only go to people's houses, and it was Mexico City was very stressful back then. So for us as kids, it was a total release, to be able to go to Tonahuixtla, and we loved it. So yeah, it became sort of our summer camp, and I think it was great for my parents as well, because it was a lot cheaper or free, as opposed to pay for us to go to a summer camp. So that's what we did for years, from when we were 6 years old until we went back to France when I was about 16. So yeah, it's a solid 10 years.
So I'm interested. I mean, obviously Tonahuixtla has had this profound effect on your work, but I'm also interested in what effect growing up somewhere like Mexico City might have had.
I don't know. I think the contrast between both places was very formative for me, like I said, Mexico City was just enormous, 20-something million people, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, one of the most polluted as well. So I think for me growing up, I was very aware about sort of the concentration of people and the environmental issues of a metropolis like Mexico City, you know, because you could feel it. You know, we would have days where we couldn't go out and play because the pollution was so bad that, you know, the government had to issue like bans on people being outside. And then by contrast, you would go to Tonahuixtla and it was you know, super pure air. So there was that on that side, and then on the other side, there was the social aspect of it. You know, Mexico City, because it was so dangerous, you kind of, you know, Mexico is very divided, and the social classes are very marked. So, you know, us being sort of European descent and more white, you tend to hang out mostly with people of your background, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, people live in big houses with big fences, with big gates, with guards. And you rarely interact with people that are, you know, quote unquote lower class, which, you know, obviously by no coincidence tend to be of more indigenous descent. So going to Tonahuixtla was an incredible exercise as well in sort of breaking those barriers, because I think we were quite lucky to experience that when we were young children, because you don't have the prejudices of, you know, when people start to grow up. So you're a lot more open to interact with, you know, people you know, that were family members of Delfino or people in their village. And we therefore had an experience that almost no white Mexicans ever had, which was to really get to, you know, for example, participate in a corn harvest, you know, get to carry out some of the traditions that you would see in these small villages, which are completely different from the city. You know, sometimes when I give talks nowadays, I talk about these differences, you know, and I remember I was giving a talk in Reykjavik in Iceland, and I was explaining, you know, I think nowadays there will be more things in common between you in Reykjavik and a white person in Mexico City, than that white person in Mexico City and someone indigenous that only lives maybe a couple of hours away. Mm. So being able to trespass these barriers, the social barriers, I think was extremely formative for me. Because, you know, both my sister and I, you know, started to realize these sort of imbalances as well socially. That, you know, I think as we started to grow up, we became more and more aware of.
You moved back to Paris when you were 15 or 16.
Yeah.
That must have been a bit of a culture shock, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you know, we were... we moved back to Paris. It was the first time we were in an international school. You know, before we were just in a regular Mexican school. So this exposure to people from all over the world all of a sudden was extremely eye-opening. And obviously, I think it put things even more in perspective. I think it was extremely, you know, I think the most formative moments of my life were definitely the moment we went to Tonahuixtla and the moment we went to Paris. Because it gives you this sort of micro and macro lens, you know, of the world. We had the privilege of being able to witness what happens in a small indigenous village, and then in a global city, you know, and then follow that with London. I mean, that was even more. So, yeah, I think this is what's so interesting about the experiences that I've had the privilege of having, you know, which is to be able to zoom in and out, and to have this sort of global perspective, while at the same time having this very localized experiences.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because you did the product design course at Central St. Martin's, obviously in London. Why that course? Why the decision to move to London?
I thought Paris design schools were a little bit square, to be honest with you. You know, it was there were very long programs. It was all very, very sort of contrived. So yeah, I've never actually. I had absolutely no attraction to England. I have never even visited England. I just decided, yeah, St. Martin's looks like a fun place to be in. And, let's go without even ever being in England. So yeah, it was great.
And you graduated with kind of, well, I guess they were kind of almost like glassware, but made from sugar. The interest in food and food design had already developed by this stage.
Yeah. I mean, I think, my course in Central St. Martin's was interesting in the sense that I learned all the skills of design for sure, and to be able to communicate ideas in a clear way and to present it. And, I learned great skills in design. But I think I was a little bit frustrated with how producty the product design course was. I was very, very focused on sort of mass consumption, and packaging. And this was at a time where, I guess they were right on the money in the sense of how they were structuring the course, because their prognostic was that, it was designing for the age of personal computers, personal phones. This was in 2008. So yeah, it was very, very much about products, but I was a little bit frustrated with how much plastic we were using, how permanent it was all being, and so I started to develop my own little projects. The Loofah project started out of that, a self-directed sort of thing while I was a student. And then with the glassware, it was my way of being like, okay, let's try to apply everything I've learned here, all the industrial techniques. So in this case, it was like, designing with 3D printing and rotational molding and everything to make a rotational mold. But the last step was like, okay, let's play with this. Instead of using resin or instead of using instead of using plastic, let's use sugar, because sugar behaves like glass. I saw that, I think I came across that idea when I saw how they made glass props for cinema.
Right.
And I was like, well, it behaves just like glass, but it has the advantages of, being, well, first of all, really cheap, which was great when I was a student, because with 10 pounds, you got 10 kilos of sugar and you got a lot of things to experiment with. You could do it at home because back then we couldn't use anything with fire or heat at school because of health and safety things. So, I turned my kitchen into this sort of little workshop and I started to do my glasses. I got some interesting results, and this was maybe a year before graduating. And at the time I was interning for Beth and Wood, which I think you've had on your show before.
We have.
Yeah. And so she was great. She was really supportive of the idea. And she was like, well, look, we have a show for London Design Festival, and why don't you make a cocktail experience with your glasses, So that was a really great push for me to, turn it into a reality before even graduating. And when I graduated, I had this project that was already very, very solid, for a BA, because this wasn't even a master's. And that actually allowed me to stay in London, funnily enough, because back then I didn't have a EU passport, and it was really hard to stay. And that project allowed me to win somewhat of a scholarship and a special visa to be able to stay in the UK. And so but it had its sort of conditions, I had to make a certain amount of money. So I eventually had to turn that into a business, because my visa was depending on that. I had to be turning over a certain amount of money.
I was interested. Yeah. Did you have a sense of how you're going to do that when you graduated?
Not at all. But part of the scholarship was that it was the visa was a graduate entrepreneur visa. So St. Martin's or UAL had this sort of business course that I had some sessions with, and intellectual property, and they gave you some good support to be able to turn it into a business. And I did. And, I did make some money for the first couple of years. But it eventually started to feel like, I was some sort of glorified catering service. It started off with some interesting commissions and some interesting things with galleries and the design scene, etc. And it quickly sort of devolved into making Christmas parties for like insurance companies, So it was terrible. I was like, okay, it's time to just, finish this project, and that's when I decided to take some time off, and I went to Mexico to do a residence, and that's where Totomoxtle started to happen.
Yeah, let's talk about Totomoxtle, because we have taken a bit of a digression, but I think it's important to have learnt about your background to then understand why this project came about.
Yeah,
so it was in 2015, 2016. How did it begin? What was the kind of genesis of it?
So I applied for this residency, which was a very long residency. It was 3 months. Which was perfect because I was a little bit tired of London at the time, and I was really worn out from all the sugar making. So I subletted my studio in London, and I moved to Mexico. And the place where the residency was happening was in a cultural center, which was started by an artist called Francisco Toledo, who passed a couple of years ago. But Francisco Toledo was a very accomplished artist, but he was also a very fierce activist. And he basically became sort of the patron of the arts of the city of Oaxaca in the southwest of Mexico. Oaxaca has become this sort of center for the arts. It's a very interesting city. It's always been very active with preserving their culture. But Toledo was really a force that kind of gave it this exposure. He started the ethnobotanical garden there, the cultural center for the graphic arts, numerous libraries along the city, and amongst the many buildings that he founded there's the Casa, which used to be in an old textile factory just outside of the city of Oaxaca. It's a beautiful, beautiful colonial building. And I had the privilege of having, board, food, and studio for 3 months there. So I arrived there, and I arrived in a very interesting time because Mexico was basically deciding whether or not they were going to put a ban on genetically modified maize. And this was something that started because of protests and activism from everything from artists to chefs, which then, grew and grew, and it sort of got taken by the general population, and there were massive protests. And eventually, the Supreme Court had to come to a decision about it. So this was exactly at the time where I arrived to the residency. The residency was meant to be about food. And so it was a little bit of a no-brainer, to try to tackle the issue of corn.
So this is really interesting because it seems to me it's all tied into the changes that have been ascribed to the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA for short.
Exactly.
Which, for the listeners' benefit, is a trading bloc between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Mm-hmm. It was an idea that was part of Ronald Reagan's manifesto in 1980 when he was elected, and was finally enacted in 1994. The consensus appears to be that it has been useful for some parts of the Mexican economy, particularly the car industry, but it's been a disaster for agriculture. So I guess the question is why? Well,
basically, we've always been a country of farmers, and we're very successful at producing food. And we were also very protective of our market, and especially how things were grown. It was very, very strict regarding fertilizers, regarding pesticides, regarding chemicals in agriculture. What happened with NAFTA was that the country wanted to modernize, or at least the presidency of Mexico at the time wanted to really bring Mexico to sort of quote unquote modernity, to turn it into an economic power in Latin America. And for that, we needed manufacturing jobs. And so the deal, is very complicated, but essentially it opened the opportunity for American manufacturers to come to Mexico and set up shop here with a lot cheaper wages, in exchange of also having a lot of agricultural products from the States to come to Mexico. But for that, we had to relax a lot of our laws regarding agriculture.
This is the macroeconomics bit I was talking about, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, basically what happened was we opened our agricultural market, but especially the corn market, to American production. So we started to put small maize farmers in Mexico in direct competition with, huge farms in Iowa, where you have miles and miles and miles and miles of monocultures. And what that did was it lowered the price of corn hugely in Mexico by almost 2/3 from 1993 to 1994. So the only way for Mexicans to really compete against this market where corn is grown, I'm talking about the American market, corn is grown with a lot of chemical additives. It's heavily subsidized as well by the American government. And you're obviously using very efficient machinery. We had to we were forced to adopt the same system if we wanted to compete with them. Yeah. And so that's when a lot of the seed manufacturers started to peddle, with the help of the Mexican government, it must be said, sort of welfare programs, especially for the poor Mexican countryside, where farmers were given genetically modified seeds, chemical fertilizers, weed killers, and insect killers. And yeah, the expectation was that we had to produce, at least twice of the corn that we had the year before to be able to compete. So that was really in complete opposition to the traditional methods of growing corn that have been practiced here for, thousands of years. Basically, corn has always been planted in Mexico in combination with other two plants, beans and squash.
Right.
And this is something that was discovered by ancient Mesoamericans about 7,000 years ago. And what they discovered, because remember, corn is sort of this man-made plant. It has a really abnormal consumption of nitrogen from the soil. So if you only plant corn, your soils are completely eroded within a few years. Mm. But they figured out a way of balancing this out by combining with these two other plants. What happens is corn grows really quickly, and it's planted with beans right next to it. The beans start to, I'm talking about black beans, they start to kind of climb the corn plant. And so the beans are protected from insects because they're high up. But the beans have these little nodules in their roots, which fix nitrogen back into the soil. And that makes the soil fertile all the time. And you don't need any fertilizers, any added fertilizers. And then the squash is planted about a foot away from this because the squash starts to grow really quickly on the soil. And it sort of carpets the soil with this big wide leaves, and it blocks humidity in the soil. So it allows for the farmers to use a lot less water, but also it blocks sunlight. So it prevents weeds from growing. So it's a really genius system, it's weed control. It's a system which fixes nitrogen, which is what fertilizers would normally do. And you have 3 crops in one. And this has always been the traditional method. What happened was, with this sort of pressure from, this macroeconomics, there were these sort of solutions that obviously work in the American Midwest, but are very detrimental to rural Mexico in very mountainous areas where by using especially the herbicides, the weed killers, you kill absolutely everything besides from that genetically modified corn that the same companies produce. So that put an end to the milpa system, which had been in constant practice for 7,000 years. And in turn, that created really, really bad erosion. Not to mention that we started to lose a lot of the diversity of these corns, because all of a sudden the market had fixed prices. They were only buying the one corn, which was, yes, extremely productive and heavy, especially. And this is an important thing, heavy. The grains are very heavy, but that doesn't mean they're nutritious. That just means that by weight and volume, you get a lot more profit. So that was the general premise. That's what was happening when I started to do this residency. And like I said, I was in sort of the heart of all the activism for all of this because of this cultural center. This is where a lot of the protesters came to make their postcards for the protests and things like that. So it was really interesting to see how everyone was so politically active. But I didn't really see anyone proposing many sort of economical solutions to the issue, because it is an economical problem as well. And I think that's where design can be an interesting option, as opposed to art, for example, because art can be very powerful for activism. But design has this added advantage of also thinking about commerce, and economics. So yeah, I set myself the challenge of trying to, potentially come to somewhat of a contribution.
So had the idea already seeded before you went back to Tonahuixtla, or was it a visit to Tonahuixtla which engendered this idea?
So I developed the material, this idea of turning the leaves into the veneer. That happened through the residency.
Right.
But I just hadn't realized how bad the issue was until I went to Tonahuixtla. So I went to Tonahuixtla because I was looking for leaves, for colored leaves. I was, because I actually made most of my tests in Oaxaca with regular colored leaves, because it was so hard to find, the colorful ones. You would go to the markets in Oaxaca, and Oaxaca is supposed to be, one of the most traditional places in Mexico. And even there, it was extremely rare to find a bundle of colorful leaves. You would have to go to these merchants, that sell those leaves for cooking. And they would jump in their warehouses trying to look for the, maybe one or two bundles. It was really, really rare. And that was really something that shocked me quite a bit because, it had only been maybe 10 years since I left Mexico. And I was like, how could things change so much in 10 years? How could we have lost all of this in only 10 years? So I decided to go to Tonahuixtla because for me, that was the most remote place that I knew. And I was like, for sure, that place would have been unaffected by all of this. So yeah, I went back to Tonahuixtla after 10 years of not being there, after, maybe 8 of not seeing Delfino. So when I got there, it was quite shocking to see that the village was completely empty. I remember this very sort of bustling little village. And when I went there, it was like all the streets were empty. When you're driving towards the center of the town, you drive past all the fields, and all the fields were abandoned. And so it was very eerie, to find that, and it was quite shocking and quite sad, to be frank with you. And but at the same time, I arrived to Delfino's house, and he wasn't there, but Maria, his wife, was there. And she was like, well, let's go look for Delfino. And I ended up driving up a mountain, which was completely eroded. You saw all these stones were sticking out of the soil. This was cultivation areas, which before were, very fertile cornfields. And I found Delfino there with a group of men. most of them in their late 60s, digging holes, because what they were doing is they were starting to make sort of barriers for water, for catching water and for retaining soil. And maybe I should backtrack a little bit. This erosion basically was caused by the shift in agriculture, this sort of one solution fits all, adapting this American super effective agricultural techniques with chemicals, which had a completely destructive effect in Tonahuixtla. Because they stopped this traditional method of planting and they only planted corn, they exhausted their soils straight away. This region is extremely hot, it's almost a desert. So the soil is very, very fragile. And if you don't take care of it, it's gone within a couple of seasons. And that's exactly what happened. So although it was extremely disheartening to see the empty village, because essentially what happened was, people couldn't grow anything anymore. And if you have a village which, just lives off agriculture, and all of a sudden they can't do that, they all had to migrate. And, what's really ironic is that they all migrated to the United States.
Hence the wall and Trumpism, as it were.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very, very strange when you think about it. Like, we forced these indigenous villages to produce like Americans and broke a system that worked fine. Then they were all forced to migrate to the United States. And at the same time, another big change in the village that I noticed was that the very few businesses that are open there still are all sort of corner shops that basically sell Coca-Cola and Lay's and all of these junk food, American junk food, which is essentially made with corn syrup. So in a way, it's like they lost their ancestral corn only to be replaced by corn which is transformed into a very, something that is very bad for your health.
Yeah.
So it's very, I don't know, it's just very indicative of a lot of things that are wrong with the system. But like I said, at the same time, it was extremely encouraging to see Delfino and these old men digging holes to plant cactus to stop the erosion, to hold the soil and the water, with the hopes of one day being able to, plant again. And, Delfino is now 74 years old. So obviously they're not doing those efforts for themselves. They're doing it for my generation. So I thought that was extremely encouraging, and that's I think where I was like, okay, this project can't just be a material exploration thing, something that lives only for a couple of seasons in magazines, or design shows. This has to turn into a proper business. This has to really be a long-lasting project. And, I see this project as a lifelong project.
So you had this notion of going to one of the world's biggest seed banks, re-establishing traditional varieties of corn, and then turning its husks into veneer for kind of pieces of furniture and finishes. You're quite right. It was never going to be a short-term project. Was it a hard sell to the village, I wonder?
It was at the beginning.
Because I'm guessing not many of them have been to Design Miami, for instance.
No. No. And I think, I had a core of people that were interested, but in order for this to work, you really need numbers. You need quite a large group of people to subscribe to this idea. I think it was, what was challenging at the beginning was that I wasn't fully aware that obviously they were a little bit distrusting of someone that is not from the village to come and offer them seeds again, because, they've been fucked over numerous times that way by government programs, or by people from outside of their village to come and give them seeds. So, and actually, what you mentioned with the seed bank came later. At the beginning, I was just saying, okay, you know what? Let's just try and get you some colored seeds. And I was so naive. I really didn't know much about agriculture. So I was just trying to source seeds of color and gave it to them. And I was not fully aware of the complications of reintroducing a seed. Corn is, you can't just be like, oh, well, this seed comes from a similar weather. No, it has to be the exact altitude, for example, and there's a lot of other environmental sort of traits that are very, very key to successfully reintroducing a seed. So at the beginning, we planted once in Delfino's patch of land, and they didn't do very well. We didn't have a good result, so a lot of people became a little bit disillusioned with it. So I think, but we did have some leaves. So I started to do some samples, and I did a few prototypes of furniture and things like that. And what happened was, this is around end of 2016, beginning of 2017, there was a competition by something called the Dutch Institute of Food Design, which, we're launching a competition on food design. And there was a prize, monetary prize, I suppose, because I needed money as well. I was still kind of financing this with some sugar glasses, but I was still quite young, and London rent, etc. I was a bit short on cash, so I decided to apply for this competition, and for that I had to create a video, and that was the first time where I sort of realized also the power of storytelling in a very narrative way. I think a strength of the project is the story, definitely, and how you tell it is extremely important. So I put together a video that sort of, told the story up to that point and my future plans with it. And I had to put it online for the competition because there was a jury prize and there was a general public prize through voting online. And that video, I guess it became viral in Mexico. I had close to, 400,000 views on it. And so that opened a bunch of doors. And one of them was the seed bank. So that was also really interesting how design and design communication started to do links that weren't there before. Because, the Simit Seed Bank basically has the biggest collection of maize seed in the world. They're a very important institution, and they have a program where they actually constantly actively try to donate seeds to reintroduce very critically endangered species and varieties. And one of their main problems is that a lot of people are not aware of this resource. And so it was really interesting to see how they became aware of my project through this video, and how, because of that, I started to link them with a lot of these communities. So that's when we started to get professional help. I started to talk to Denise Kostic, who is the director of the seed bank. And she was like, okay, well, what have you done to try to reintroduce this? Did you take altitude measurements? And I was like, no, I was like, well, okay, that's the first mess up, So they told me how to measure altitude. They asked me for some soil samples and all sorts of things. And they basically did a curation of seeds from their vault. They selected 16 seeds that they felt had the right traits for this area. We brought Delfino and a group of the farmers to the seed bank, which was really, really interesting as well, because, they're incredibly knowledgeable of agriculture, but of traditional agriculture. So it was really interesting to see how they reacted to sort of being exposed to a scientific institution, and to see how a lot of their
traditional methods were actually validated by scientists. They were saying, well, you're doing the right thing because, you need to fix nitrogen and you need to do this and that. And yes, that happens with the beans. And yes, if you do this, you're doing the right stuff. So it was really interesting to do that. What you see as the finalized object is the result of so many steps before that. From agriculture to science to biology, to design in general.
And community. So we're there. We've got the background. How is the actual veneer itself created?
So it's sort of developed over the years. But what we do now is we harvest the corn at the end of the season. So when you eat corn in England, you're really eating immature corn. It's corn that is not fully ripe yet. Corn is normally really hard at the end of the season. So you wait until the plants are completely dry. Then we cut the cobs off, which has all the husks around them. And then I was just designing this last week a machine it's a piece of furniture really that has this circular blade where you cut the end of the corn off and then you have all the leaves basically that come off. And then you take the middle section of that leaf and you flatten it with an iron. So then you have a flat piece of corn. And then we attach that with it's kind of like a latex contact glue. So it's a natural latex glue. And then we attach that to recycled cardboard. And so that is a technique that is quite similar to how a lot of wood veneers are produced. A lot of what's called paper-backed veneers. It's essentially that. It's just a really thin slice of wood with paper on the back. So we do the same with corn. And then we have a hydraulic press, which now is a big fancy hydraulic press, but we started off with like something that was spring operated and you would have to just like hang yourself from it. And we use like cutting dies, which are essentially like cookie cutters, which cut the shapes out of the corn. And because we're limited by the size of the corn pieces, we can only grow corn, to a certain amount of centimeters. We use a technique like marquetry. So marquetry, which is a traditional wood working technique, is where you use especially rare woods, like rosewood or tulip wood or, expensive woods that you don't have big sheets of. And you cut pieces out of it and you sort of make a puzzle at the end, and so you combine all of them onto a cheaper surface like plywood or MDF or whatever. So we do that, we take all these pieces of corn, cut from the machine into these shapes, and they're all hand assembled. And depending on what we do, we back it to different surfaces. So, for example, for furniture, we can laminate it directly to plywood or something. But for wall interiors, we're now laminating them onto thin sheets of cork, recycled wine stoppers. And and so we have a system now where it's these sort of jagged tiles that tessellate and snap together, and you can make really big surfaces with that. And it all happens in Tonahuixtla, in this little village, in a workshop that we've been creating over the years. A lot of the development of the project has also been to develop the system. How do we? I've had to go through a lot of pains, and a lot of thinking of how do you create a whole system of production in an area that doesn't have internet, that doesn't have phone, doesn't have shops. You can't just go and buy the glue, if you run out. So you have to be extremely organized. And then how do you ship it from there to, London? So we have a system where we drive an hour and a half to the nearest sort of bigger village, and there's a FedEx pickup point, and we send it with the couriers all over Europe. So yeah, it's been really rewarding to see that you can prove to the village that there is value in what they have there. And you can also prove to the rest of the world that there is the opportunity to employ indigenous communities and to make them productive, and it doesn't matter that they are isolated, you can still include them in, the global market without sacrificing their traditions.
And do the buyers, wherever they may be in Europe or America, do they get the message when they buy the pieces, or are they just interested in buying something that's a beautiful piece of furniture?
I think you have different levels. You have a lot of contractors that are just looking for, they look at these sort of trend forecasting books, where they just say, okay, these are the next, the new eco things, and so they're just looking for it as a greenwashing utensil, I think, for a lot of their projects, which I'm fine with, But then you also have a core clientele which is really into the story, and they almost, they don't mind spending the money because of the backstory, and they post about it and they talk about it. So yeah, I think there's different levels of engagement. But I think the story is a really big part of why this project works, because it's putting a face to where this material comes from. And it's, I don't know, I think in a way, what we do as a business, which is interesting, is that our main focus is not necessarily the end client. I see the business obviously not as a charity, because it's not a charity. It's really something that works financially. But it's a way of creating a business that is mainly for your employees and mainly for the natural environment of where you source your materials, And I think that's a really interesting way of approaching a design challenge, It's this sort of like interspecies design. Like, how do you design a system where both the environment and the people that work it, are benefited?
Was it always an ambition to come back to Mexico and help create new industries to aid the rural economy? Had that been in the back of your mind?
Yeah, definitely. And this is because of that personal attachment that I've had with the community, since I'm a child. I think, it's been extremely rewarding to be in London, to have this sort of global outlook to the world. But at the same time, I think with issues of sustainability and things like that, if you're talking about sustainability and ecology, the conversation is very Eurocentered. It's very focused on issues of the West. And I don't think there's enough people talking about the challenges that places like Africa and Latin America are going through, because when you talk about sustainability there, you really talk about people and you talk about communities, and you can't just expect people to protect their environment and to protect their resources if in the first hand you can't protect them. You have to create a situation where people's quality of life is increased, because if it's going to be a matter of choosing whether to have education for your children or healthcare or whatever, and your only option is to cut down the trees in your backyard to sell the wood to pay for that, you're going to do it. You're going to do it. So it's a lot of my projects are yes, talking about materials, but through the materials talking about the people that are so interlinked with them, and yeah, raising these issues of injustice and inequality.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, presumably the project has had a profound effect on the village, and it's increased employment for maybe women who haven't had jobs in that village, as far as I'm aware. Has the village had an effect on your practice?
Yes, definitely. Of course it has. I think like, well, for example, I was a little bit obsessed with this idea of developing the new material, you know, and that's because you suddenly jump on this treadmill of the design calendar, you know, where every Milan you have to come up with a new thing. And, you know, magazines are constantly hassling you every 6 months, you know, like, are you working on a new, you know, wonder natural material that we could publish, you know? And I feel like I was falling into that trap, you know, into being in this sort of, this rush to come up with the next sustainable material, and it's bullshit, you know. It doesn't work unless you can make it work as a system, and that takes years, you know. And especially if you're working with agriculture, it's really interesting to see how time is measured differently in different disciplines, you know. Like, I have a lot of magazines that are not interested in my projects anymore because, you know, they've been published. And so if you look at the expiration date on a lot of these projects in the design world, it's, you know, maximum 5 years if they want to be relevant. But then, for example, I've been getting a lot of press, and I've been getting a fair amount of attention from agricultural magazines, you know, which is really, really interesting. And when you talk to agronomists and to agriculturists, you know, they're like, oh, you're just starting, you know, you're in your third or fourth season. I mean, you're not going to have a stable crop until maybe 5 or 6 years down the line, you know. And this is that will be basically where the project can start to go into that middle sort of development. So yes, you know, designing with these people in mind, with Tonahuixtla in mind, and, you know, with the sisal is a similar thing with the agave fibers, you know, because, you know, an agave takes 7 years to grow, you know. So in order to source your material, you're talking about many, many years. So yeah, working with these people have, very, very profoundly changed how I design, what my goals and expectations are, and also have given me a lot more sort of peace of mind, you know. Like I used to be quite anxious about not having success straight away with a lot of these projects, and these projects have shown me that you know, Totomoxtle especially has shown me that it takes years to be able to do it properly.
Because my final question, I think I've taken up a lot of your time, but my final question was going to be, generally, traditionally, is what your plans for the future are. But it sounds as if this is a long-term project. We will still be talking about this in 7 years' time. Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, you know. Like, for example, right now, we finished the workshop, which used to be a community building, which was a school as well. And it had been abandoned since 1995 because everyone migrated. So, you know, the project has been financing the restoration of this building. And this is now not only my workshop, but it's also the office where they decide what happens to their lands, because all of their lands are communally owned. And that's also where we're building a seed bank, for example. So we're now also going to have our own seed bank to be able to have a backup of everyone's seeds within the village. And that's a project that's going to take years and years and years. And we're now, for example, thinking of ways of making sort of kits for people to be able to do at least half of the process directly in their house. So that means that we can expand to other communities in the area. So yeah, it's gonna be a project which is gonna be very, very long term, and I'm quite excited for that.
Well, very good. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, Fernando. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Grant. Glad to be part of it.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to learn more about Totomoxtle and Fernando's other projects, go to fernandolaposse.com. There are images from the interviews, as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to my Patreon page and make a pledge at patreon.com/material matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you're all staying safe.